I was awed by the poignancy of her language. Prose that is piercing both emotionally and critically, and that is always careful to situate itself in place and time. Kathleen is mirrored in the landscapes of her writing as the landscape is mirrored in her. What becomes a heartbreaking relationship that exposes the fragility of both. Consider the opening lines of The Evangelist, a chapter published in Gulf Coast from her memoir in progress. Then an evangelist rigged a pulpit of dirt floor and plywood off the dead-end interstates in Texas. 2 nights and he'd fly bullet fire straight up I-27 to Amarillo, the same direction runoff once rivered cotton fields together like a shimmering thread. Back when farmers believed God left a bottomless ocean under all the upturned dirt, and the government gave them enough money to pump sacred rock. Story was a farmer paddled a canoe 124 miles from Lubbock to Amarillo. I lived in Lubbock, above the southern end of that once vast aquifer. I was 12, with little idea of the drying sediment, the vanishing well under my feet. At the time, I feared one thing only. Dad would die because of me, end quote. As the earth was drained by the presence of a hungry humanity, and as the evangelist seems formed from the clay of human wreckage, rigging his pulpit of dirt floor and plywood from a dead-end interstate, so does the young Kathleen, birthed from an evangelical family and community, fear that she drains the life of her father through a lack of faith in what the evangelical God can speak into being. Kathleen takes pains in her writing to understand the damage done to herself, our communities, and our earth through the false narratives we consume and dangerously perpetuate. History's reflection in the landscapes of her prose produces a melancholy and weighted atmosphere that allows the reader to question their own role in these histories. I invited Kathleen to give a presentation to my classes last semester on the personal essay in her piece, Daughter Tongue, an essay that won the 2017 AWP Intro Journals Project in Nonfiction and was listed as notable in Best American Essays 2018. The focus of her presentation, the personal in the personal essay, explored this weight of history and place, as her quoting of James Baldwin encapsulated. People are stuck in history, and history is stuck in people. As with The Evangelist, Daughter Tongue's setting, the island of Guam, is unstable and fragile, existing as it does within the nexus of the competing stories that form the place, as well as the personal relationships that connect Kathleen to it. In this case, her birth on Guam, where her father was stationed with the Air Force, somewhere Kathleen has no memory of other than the stories she received from her parents, with the added knowledge of the contradictory historical accounts she uncovers in her research. Kathleen investigates her relation to the island and these inherited stories, asking, quote, what does it mean to be born on Guam? What happens when I speak the memories that my mother gave me, open these secrets that I've carried like talismans, end quote. As we see throughout Kathleen's work, speaking these secrets rewrites time and exposes scars both historical and personal. Kathleen refuses to separate the two, instead committing herself to grappling with the contradictions that emerge. She takes a personal stake in her writing to undo the damage to history and the landscape that carries that hurt, tracing the myths her life and local history were founded upon, whether those imposed by Christian evangelism or American imperialism. To my great benefit, Kathleen's empathy and desire for truth extends far beyond her writing. She's an extremely kind and loving person who extends her care to those close to her as she does to the land and history Western culture has warped and abused. Her work with the Freshwater Lab, her position as instructor of creative nonfiction workshops at the University of Chicago, and the dedication she brings to her writing are all continuations of her desire to do the work that needs to be done to understand our place in the world and how we can give back and rebirth that which we have stolen and destroyed. Her writing has appeared or is forthcoming in Colorado Review, Crazy Horse, Diagram, Guernica, and elsewhere. And I'd strongly suggest you seek it out where you can. As is likely quite apparent at this point, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce my friend, Kathleen Blackburn.
Evan, thank you so much. What a beautiful introduction. I'm very, very moved. And as I do every time you write something, I am challenged and I learn something. Thank you for your friendship. Ander, it is such an honor to share this event, this reading this afternoon with you. Thank you so much to Chris Mazza for organizing the reading and the grant writing that went into making this happen. I so appreciate you all being here. A big shout out to my homies. I also am deeply grateful to the members of my committee. It's such a privilege to work with each one of you. And finally, a big, though inadequate, thank you to my partner, my husband, Michael. He's backstage. Evan did a beautiful job setting up the framework for actually what I'm going to read this afternoon, which is a brief excerpt from the memoir I've been working on. To that, I will only add these details. The memoir is called The Pilot's Daughter. It thinks about the way that our lives are shaped by the landscapes we call home. The book traces my family's history in the Air Force and discovers my father, like countless military personnel, consumed drinking water tinctured by carcinogens from the military's decades-long use of firefighting foams. In 1997, my father was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and he and my mother, a woman of spitfire and brimstone, began seeking faith healers across West Texas, even as toxic water had already rewritten my father's DNA. The excerpt I'm going to read takes place during what seemed at the time to be a pivotal moment when we would learn what stage of disease my father was in. But these are also the pages where I begin to tell the story of water that shaped our lives and is so bound up with ideas of lineage, privatization, modernity, and faith. This excerpt comes from a chapter called A House Divided. My grandparents arrived in Lubbock after the 8-hour drive from South Central Texas, and Mom said she'd serve up some waters. Grandma knew the script. She told plenty of stories about her daughter-in-law, most of which began with the slick condensation of a drinking glass and ended with, "John adores her." Back home, my grandparents might have sipped sherry from crystal glasses, but now Grandma followed Grandpa into the guest room with a glass of water, please. It was 5 o'clock somewhere, not here. The two women weren't such a far cry from their first meeting 17 years earlier, when Mom arrived at my grandparents' place starched as cotton duck canvas. Grandma tried to see through the one-word answers and press-line grin to the college girlfriend Dad had described over the phone as a sweet two-stepper and brilliant veterinarian student, not the mannequin poised on Grandma's white couch. As her son claimed, the young woman was beautiful, rightly so. Mom sat stiff-backed, but Grandma sensed in her something wound as a latched spring. Come on the years, and Mom's tension did give way to frenetic movement, setting plates to table, food to plate, sinks to run, thank yous to said, thank you, thank you. Mom bounced dinner parties faster than songbirds flit rainwater. Some might call it anxiety. Mom, she called it being polite. Dad attributed this social reluctance to Mom's intelligence and held her in awe. He often said that no room existed where Mary Edens was not the smartest and most handsome, and his parents' wet bar did not constitute an exception. To heck if she was shy. He'd heard a fair amount of too much talk from people with less than nothing to say. But chatter could be a gift at times like these, and he rested a hand on Mom's knee. He liked to think he could offer Mom the ease of affection missing from her life, the only aspect she seemed to lack. I imagine Grandma observed Dad's gentle gestures and subtle flexes of protection, and Mom noticed her noticing. Maybe Mom wanted to flick Dad's hand away. The only thing worse than failing the family's expectations would be to show that she gave a rat's rocketeering backside. Grandma noted Mom's reserve. She'd been moved by Dad's overtures, and a part of her felt it wasn't really any of her business whom he loved. A big heart can take on a lot, but that doesn't mean it should. Was love the only thing missing from Mary's life? Perhaps then Grandma began to wonder if the rigor of Mom's spine was attached to a deeper inflexibility. What exactly had her son signed up for? Mom started when Grandma asked if she'd like a cocktail. I'll have a water, please. Do you take ice? Yes. Not a budge. Ask my grandmother to tell it, and she might say that on that afternoon, the next 2 decades rolled out before her like a highway with blinding curves. She'd say, I didn't know, but I knew. Over the years, my grandparents felt they'd withstood a fair number of surprises from Lubbock. Dorothy and Tom Blackburn had tolerated Mom's alternative ideas. She wanted to compost, wanted a midwife, wanted to homeschool all 5 of the kids. Okay, she was smart. Anyone could see that. A veterinarian, a reader, a good cook. Let her teach the children geometry and English, Latin too, if she insisted. Us kids seemed to be coming along all right. Had no idea who the Beatles were, but college would teach us. We were polite and good-hearted. Yes, their daughter-in-law was doing a fine job of things, even if some of her ideas were high-minded. And John adored Mary, so pour another martini. But when Dad called saying he had cancer, maybe bad, my grandparents loaded up the Lincoln and bootlegged a bottle of red wine to Lubbock. They thought someone with some damn sense needed to be in the room. This wasn't about lifestyle, it was about life. The white Lincoln turned at the street corner and a blade of light rose across it. My grandparents appeared posh and gently used people. Grandpa's polished Oxford shone pristine and Grandma's gold chain draped with the wisp of a gold wedding band. Holding her palms to mine, she said that we had the same hands. She warned that my knuckles would swell, each one in its own time. That was the closest we came to talk of death, though a torque of dread twisted in my chest as Dad drew his mother into his arms. Grandma asked what smelled so good, and he said it was the spaghetti. Nigh dinner, my grandparents vanished into one end of the house and my parents to the other, as though grievance were graphed into the poles of the hallway that ran the length of our home. From the outside, our white brick ranch style looked humble with a single carport and basketball hoop. But once inside, the foyer opened to a hallway like a maze. There was a feeling of having been misled. On moving day, I wondered, how far does this house go? The explanation was simple. A previous owner added 3 more bedrooms. But almost everyone who saw the hallway for the first time cheeped awkwardly, as though the sight of it dredged up a long buried anxiety. I imagine what occurred after my grandparents shut the guest room door. They must have been careful not to let their voices travel down the spine of the house. Grandma might have emptied her water glass and said something like, that ought to take the edge off. Humor, rhetorical shrugs. That was the Blackburn way. She would have set to work placing her folded slacks in the empty dresser, and a tendency of hers to tidy up when nothing else in life felt ordered. Maybe her mind darted. Her son had looked so strident as he crossed the yard to greet her. When she took him into her arms, she thought, this has got to be some sick joke. His firm body, a promise. The dying don't feel like that. Her 5th and final child had been born a few days after his heart stopped. Back then, my grandparents lived on the Air Force Base in Birkenfeld. Grandma stayed behind in Germany with the rest of their children while Grandpa accompanied an impossibly small casket aboard a freighter across the Atlantic to the National Cemetery in Virginia, where among the fallen, a soldier can bury his children. The name Paul was engraved into a small headstone above the year 1963. Dad was 4 years old. Grandma refused to bury another child. She thought to secret the Merlot in the bedside table. The girth of the bottle held the drawer open, and she had the improved idea to fish the opener from her cosmetic bag. There was a tumor growing in Dad's colon. That's all anyone knew. Grandma replayed the events of the last few weeks. A sharp pain below Dad's waistline had caved him. He folded again when he stood at the commode. He asked Mom if he should see a doctor, and the woman, who could find almost any reason not to, said yes. For this capitulation, Grandma thought, thank God at least. A gastrologist recommended a colonoscopy. He later pointed to a bulge and compared it to a tennis ball. Though Dad's health appeared fine at his mandatory pilot's exam only a few months before, the specialist said that colon cancer grows quite slowly, and he was sorry in this case. Given the size, the mass had probably been accumulating immortal cells for at least 2 years. Grandma blamed that quack of a doctor at American Airlines. What was his name? Macaulay McCulkey. You know who I mean. He'd said Dad had runner's hemorrhoids, and Dad agreed that it was likely. But who was the doctor in the room? The one who sent Dad home with a clean bill of health, a phrase referring to the 18th century practice of clearing the captain of a vessel to leave port. But even Grandma had to admit she thought the same thing as that company physician. Everyone did. Dad had recently bested his personal record of a 6-minute mile. He was 38 and didn't check any boxes for malady. There was no family history of cancer, and Dad didn't drink, smoke, or vote Democrat. He was so young, so healthy. Men like that don't get cancer. Still, that didn't mean the whole medical establishment should be abandoned. Grandma weighed the odds. If the scan results showed the cells lived in only one place, the disease would be considered treatable. But she worried an early stage diagnosis wouldn't be enough to get them out of the woods. There was still her daughter-in-law, who winced at medical consensus and said things about the patient's right to direct his own care. Grandma's empty glass must have come in handy right about then. She decanted the Merlot from water to wine. The dining table was fitted with its leaf to expand into a long banquet and set with 9 drinking glasses. As I think of Grandma observing the setup, I imagine her mind cast back to the many times Mom had hauled cases of bottled water from the trunk whenever we visited my grandparents. Leave it to Mary to say, take something as easy as water and make a do. Mom thought public water plumed in gray clouds as it filled your glass. Any number of bacteria lived in the water, as one looking could observe in the white opacity of the ice. But don't tell your grandparents I said that, she'd say, as though the cartloads of ice mountain communicated anything less. In Lubbock, Mom liked to say we had good water, and she meant filtered by an expensive system, specifically in our faucets. Our water, Mom said, was so pure you could taste what wasn't there. No runoff, no microbes, no industry polymers, nor, good Lord, any arsenic or chemical runoff. She said city water gave a towel in the skin and teeth, like smokers, she'd say. What water was left to the modern age was in need, like modern souls, of salvation. And if you ask Mom, the municipal treatment plant was not up to the job. But therein lay the beauty of inalienable rights. Where institutions failed, a hardworking American could buy a better way. Mom got reborn evangelical, and a guy wearing a starched shirt and holding a clipboard came by, and she signed the contract with Culligan. Grandma figured the only thing keeping her daughter-in-law modern was a love of convenience. Otherwise, she'd have pumped water with a handle from her own private well. Just as well Dad retired from the military, Grandma thought. There hadn't been a non-political war since the big one, and Mom was not cut out to be an officer's wife. Imagine hauling your personal ass water bottles halfway around the globe. And tote those crates, Grandma had no doubt Mary would have. She had to give it to my mother. The woman was determined. But Grandma was not too good for the tap. If she appreciated our crystal clear water, I traced in her face nothing impressed. Sitting next to her, I inhaled powder and something floral like geranium and a whisper of booze. Born in Racine, Wisconsin in 1920 to a meat packer, Grandma thought the 20th century had done the country some good. You want miracles? The wife of a U.S. Air Force colonel, Grandma figured she drank water from all over the world. In the post-war era, neighborhoods as big as towns blossomed along the interstates, and with them, Air Force bases, numbering at close to 200 by 1956. National defense, Eisenhower contended, needed highways. He signed the act, and the so-called wisdom of broader ribbons rose and fell with the grooves of the earth like they'd always been there. The landscape felt unspoiled, as though the cleaves left by the Depression and Dust Bowl and internment camps had been sutured by concrete. If those weren't miracles, then what were? When my grandparents learned they'd be leaving Germany and stationed at a suburb outside of San Antonio called Universal City, I imagine it sounded right. Universal, not for containing the cosmos, but because it was a modern system of highways and underground pipes. Universal City, because cities like it were becoming the everywhere, a detail that contained the whole standardized by the American dream, a totality of green lawn, strip mall, good high schools. 20 miles from downtown San Antonio, Universal City was only 2.7 miles from Randolph Air Force Base, Grandpa's last station before retirement. But it may as well have been US anywhere. If you were a Blackburn, a white kid, a man on salary, it was. Mom asked who wanted to bless dinner. I'll do it, Dad said. Grandma took my hand gently, a civil gesture, as she was Catholic and didn't care much for the impromptu prayer at the non-denominational. Dad thanked God for bringing his parents safely from Universal City, for the delicious food Mom prepared. It's not the best of circumstances, he prayed, but we know you work all things for the good. In my memory of these words, I now hear Dad's attempt to reassure all of us that there was a reason for this brief scare, that a test of faith, if passed, would be rewarded. Grandma's hand tightened, a flinch, I imagine, at hearing in Dad's prayer an echo of what he had said on the phone, that suffering could yield meaning, that the God he prayed to had promised the true believer a bountiful life. Why wasn't he talking about chemo? The prayer ended and my grandparents crossed themselves. Grandpa said, I think I'll come with you and Mary tomorrow if that's all right. I thought I'd feel relieved when somebody finally acknowledged my grandparents' trip wasn't just another family visit for a homeschool play. But when Grandpa mentioned the next appointment with the results of CAT scans, I felt a tug in my gut, like I was hooked from the inside to an invisible rope. Dad thanked his father and said, that'll be fine. Who could bear the magnanimity of the next day? I remember quelling my fears by saying to myself that by this time tomorrow, all the dread will have passed. A line of light shone along the bottom of the guest room door when I turned to my bedroom. My sisters and I slept in the bedroom at the midway point of the hallway, and a part of me has remained caught there, halfway between the faith of my parents and the struggle of my grandparents, pooling in this story of lineage and family blood. What if I had slipped from beside the sleeping bodies of my sisters and walked outside of my room? Which direction would I have turned? At the back of the house, Dad surely comforted my mother, even as she assured him that only good would come of his prognosis. And if I had walked to the front of the house and pressed my ear to the door of the guest room, perhaps I would have heard through the dark the questions that have followed me past Dad's death into adulthood. How was it that two grown, college-educated adults of good intention and means came to plead wholly with lifted hands and lips sputtering verse? By what logic does one arrive at a healing, mysterious, and corporeal? In these questions, I might have heard the note of contempt I sometimes picked up in my grandmother's voice, a scorn masking itself politely as confusion. Only now, I recognize the tone as my own. Literally, my millennial brain squawks at me. We thought God would literally heal Dad. It is the stuff of my sleeplessness. And yet, living apace with the what and how of my childhood in hopes of unearthing the why, I arrive instead at a glass of water. Thank you. My prop. Ander Monson. Ander Monson's oeuvre has been described as playful, breathtakingly original, poetic, startling, funny. His recent nonfiction book, I Will Take the Answer, was hailed in the New York Times as odd, obsessive, and wildly romantic, with essays that ride against scheme and structures of genre and the assumptions of form. In one of my favorite essays from this collection, entitled I in River, the vignettes of the text are arranged spatially with alternating alignment, separated by vast and uneven swaths of white space. You might think, oh, like currents. No, like the disillusion of language when water meets paper, like remnants after the flood, like the psychic space of memory, like the dry channel where water once was an inhabited absence, like, as Monson writes, a thaumatrope, a disc with two distinct images on each side, twirled on a string. Monson's collection, Neck Deep and Other Predicaments, was awarded the coveted Grey Wolf Press Nonfiction Prize. The book includes a series of essays that adopt pre-existing forms, an essay as an outline, as an index, an essay about snow written in ellipses, another essay in ellipses, but this time about failure, which begins, if there is a form, there must be a failure of form, and there must always be further failures. I have taught neck deep to a group of advanced creative nonfiction students, and rarely has a text inspired more excitement and curiosity about the relationship between content and form. Though it has been a minute since the class in question, I still remember how one student, while reading Monson's work, was also learning the Adobe program InDesign. In one of his submissions, the body of the text was shaped literally like a horse. These flirtations with genre are often called experimental, suggesting their aim, their existence, is born of combustion, reaction, test, the beloved essay definition of attempt. Monson himself has claimed he does like to set fires. Fair enough. But in Monson's work, we also find, as Annie Dillard might put it, a way of seeing. And what do we see? An essay in a list, in a sports bracket, in a codex. We see our material and immaterial lives reimagined. We perceive in the already existing forms that frame, document, codify, and constrict sparks of possibility, convention, repurposed. Ander Monson is the author of 8 books, including I Will Take the Answer and the Gnome Stories from Grey Wolf. He edits the magazine Diagram, among other projects, and he directs the MFA program at the University of Arizona. It is fitting that this afternoon, mine would be the opening act. Mine, an emergent voice in a literary landscape shaped in part by the presence of today's guest writer. It is not possible to overstate the influence he has had on contemporary creative nonfiction writers. The essayist must contend with Ander Monson in resistance or embrace, or as he does with his own work, in both. Please join me in welcoming Ander Monson.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was awesome. And also a hard act to follow. I'm looking forward to talking afterwards. And thank you all for having me. This was supposed to happen last year. And like a lot of things that were supposed to happen last year got delayed a little bit. So even though we can't be together in person, I still really appreciate the opportunity to come and visit with you and talk with you. So I'm going to read 3 things, one of which is the first time I've read it. We're going to see how that goes. But I'm going to read 2 excerpts from the I Will Take the Answer. And all of them have some video component. So there'll be a little something for you to pay attention to on the screen that's not just me. So I'm going to read the beginning of the first essay, and it's called 5-Star Review of a Safeway. Let's begin this book with a hole, specifically a storm sewer that is designed to flush everything in its path from underneath Campbell Avenue into the Rito River, running along the northern boundary of Tucson, Arizona, where it will eventually empty into the Santa Cruz. This space is man-made, concrete, and it's hard to forget that fact, that this is no cave, no hidden area carved out of the earth by a million years of limestone drip and white lives lived in silence away from sunlight. 1 million people live in the Tucson metro area, not counting the uncounted, not to say the uncountable. These white and not so white lives lived in sunlight or avoiding it. Of those million, maybe a couple hundred have ever been more than a few feet inside this passage. And if you come to Tucson, I would recommend you check it out. I'm not entirely sure why I was drawn here to this hole. It could be that I'm normed by having played thousands of hours of video games, exploring passages that look an awful lot like this, or by coming from Upper Michigan's copper country, where I'd regularly run across abandoned holes in the ground that I would fill with the requisite childhood wonder. It could also be that in this land of light, I seek darkness and was just curious to see how far in it went and what secrets it keeps. This particular storm sewer opens under the long biking and running path called the loop that runs underneath the Campbell Bridge over the Rito. From the path, it looks just like a tunnel, maybe 6 feet in diameter. Small bits of bric-a-brac are scattered by its opening where it enters the wash. The tunnel is dry. I don't know how long it is. There is no gate, nothing locked or barred, just a man-sized hole that retreats into darkness. It's not raining right now, so I check in with my history of doing foolhardy things and head inside. After a few minutes out of the sun, my eyes adjust gradually, irritated, unused to so little contrast. The passage is almost tall enough for me to stand up straight in it. It is mostly clean. By day, Tucson is almost oppressively bright, but at night it is a dark city, so named because of laws forbidding excess nighttime artificial light, so as not to disrupt the work of the astronomers at one of the many observatories outside or on the surrounding mountain ranges. And wanting to get away from civilization is in part why people come to Tucson and to the West, and having to be reminded that down the street there are 5 Bed Bath and Beyonds isn't that helpful to this mythology. So as such, night is dark once you get off the main roads. Few lights adorn residential streets. Even porch lights are low wattage if they are on at all. Tucson is a city of roads and low buildings, a scrappy town that, despite itself, seems to believe it's still a Wild West cow town. Like most Western cities, it sprawls wide and long and horizontal, a grid designed around the car, featuring Speedway Boulevard, the quote, ugliest street in America, according to Life magazine in 1970. To be fair, though it's no beauty, Speedway has improved in the 40-something years since then. It has to be the only street in America that connects 2 mountain ranges, so that's something. What's underneath the street isn't something most of us think about a whole lot. That is, until something we took for granted fails. Someone opens fire in a school or a crowded Safeway, like the one 5 miles away, or a sinkhole opens up. And this essay sort of is written in some fragments, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This essay is written on the occasion of the most recent American mass shooting you can think of. The questions I have about violence and darkness and structures and knowing remain largely the same as they did in 2012 after the Gifford shooting, and without our having made much progress on them, a thing that we're reminded of even in the last couple weeks. I will hope to be proved wrong, but in the meantime, because I don't even know what I can say about the mass shooting of grade school kids, I won't even try. I'll try to stick to the thing that most recently and closely wounded me. A mile deep in the tunnel, I freak out for a second. It's dark and close and smells vaguely of human refuse, and I have to calm myself back down. Most of the time, this way is safe to traverse, but the monsoon, southern Arizona's strange, humid 5th season, just began, which means the possibility of sudden and powerful thunderstorms flooding Tucson's few storm sewers with thousands of cubic feet per second of runoff. I need to pay attention. I must be careful in the timing of my exploration. The good news is there's no weather predicted. The bad news is that down here it's hard to feel any connection whatsoever to the outdoor world and its predictions, its petty concerns, and rainfall from a long way away can quickly flood the sewers. Like living in Upper Michigan with its powerful and sudden blizzards, living in Tucson is a reminder of our precariousness. My beloved vintage Mondale Ferraro election bumper sticker faded in the sun in less than a year. The wrong paint can fade in days. Most every desert plant harbors barbs or painful spines. Animals are poisonous or ornery. A sign at one of the state parks begs, quote, "Do not touch or taunt a rattlesnake. It is not a test of your strength or speed or skill," unquote. That's wrong. Trying to pick up a rattlesnake is indeed a test, if not a wise one. But the teenage boys who receive 95% of snake bites, typically to the hands and face, do not need an encouragement. Our gun laws here are famously lax. No permit is required to carry, and you can find guns readily. I drive by half a dozen firing ranges or gun shops every day on my way to and from my job. Not that this fact is unusual in much of America. And for long stretches of time, this world appears not to change whatsoever. And then in an hour, in the monsoon especially, July and August, it is submerged, deluged, swamped, many of the city's roads impassable. Every year, the news runs stories of hikers trapped in box or slot canyons, flooded and killed. We all tut, tut, tut and mock the tourists. So being flooded in the storm sewer would be a tourist move, a really dumb way to die, even for me. I have a history of not thinking things through. I want not to be a tourist, even when I am one. On the first day of my nonfiction workshops at the U of A, I asked my students to tell us about something dramatic that happened to them in the last year. We're going around in a circle sharing stories when Linda S. tells us that before she transferred here, she'd had a class with Jared Loeffner at Pima Community College, Loeffner being the guy who shot Giffords and murdered a number of other people in the Safeway, which is sort of like the instigating incident in a way for the whole book, and the instigating incident for the next book, which I'll read from in a little bit here too. She says she might be writing about it, she tells us. Trigger warning, she says. Ha ha. The laughter is less than comfortable. This isn't that much longer. This is just this fall after the shooting. Before going back to school, she'd worked as a psychiatric nurse, she tells us. And when she saw him, she could see the signs immediately. She told the professor, and then the administration at the college, that they had a problem. This guy was not safe, she said. I know, she said. I know. He's nuts. Clinically, nuts is the word. He belongs in an institution. But there's nothing they could do, they told her. He has every right to be in that class until he does something. So she told us, she started sitting as close as she could to the door every class. She had her eye on it constantly. And when she heard about the shooting on the news, she thought to herself, oh God. So I'm going to switch to reading a different section. This sort of exploration of the storm sewers goes on for a while, and I kind of wandered through the storm sewers, like thinking about like a couple different things as I try to find my way to wherever it brings me, and thinking a lot about dungeons and video games and stuff like that, which show up also a lot in the next in the next book too. So I'm going to read, this is another essay a little bit later on, and it's called Uncharitable Thoughts on Dokken. And Dokken is a not very good hair metal band who I'm sure does not really deserve to have an essay written about them. But here you go. This is for you, Don Dokken. And I'm just going to read the first section of this. It's called Uncharitable Thoughts on Dokken. Without warning, it's probably a bad idea to begin an essay with Dokken, an 80s metal band you would be forgiven for not knowing, particularly since I'm coming from a position of skepticism regarding their oeuvre, which, if you're aware of it at all, is likely due to the song they wrote and the associated Freddy Krueger featuring video for Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. I'll take you down that road, but first another, which begins with a sign for a town in northern Michigan, not far from where I grew up, that read Donken. Like many towns up there, it was once a town and now is not, and owed its existence in one way or another to its proximity to mines or trees or water. Every town in that area echoes something gone. I suppose most towns do. And driving through them as a kid, I don't think I understood what a town was for an embarrassingly long time. Did it really have to be more than a pair of signs and a number signifying population? Well, don't bother looking Donken up. It's one of those nothings through which you drive and might wonder about long enough to find you've driven through the town and are on to more wilderness. It's unincorporated. Google Street View won't let you plow through it on your browser. Sometimes I think the only reason I remember Donken is because it sounds funny, like donkey. And more often than not, when I drove through it, someone had used spray paint to make the first N into a K so that it read not Donken, but Dokken. And this has like sections that are taken from Dokken's song titles. I spent a lot of time listening to a lot of Dokken for this essay, which I hope you don't need to do. They have like, they got a pretty good playlist of 10 or 12 songs that are pretty good. And beyond that, I don't know about that. So this section is called Felony, which is one of their songs. And it's a really bad song. I wasn't offended at the defacing. I'd vandalized or defaced plenty myself, including for no real reason setting fire to a stop sign down the street from my house. I used gasoline I had stolen from the Boy Scouts, an organization for which I was inexplicably made quartermaster. What annoyed me was not the act of defacing, but its result. Dokken? Really? Fucking Dokken? I was aware of them as one of the also-rans of the hair metal band era, and I'd seen a couple of videos on MTV, which aren't, let's be honest, all that great, but which inspired a visceral reaction in me at the time in ways I still don't entirely understand. And it wasn't as if I was listening to cooler bands. I owned the entire Poison discography. I saw Warrant opening for Poison in Detroit. I saw Brittany Fox live, and I still know how to spell that band's name correctly. One of the first few CDs I owned and loved was the eponymous album by Wilson Phillips, which I bought along with Fifth Angel's Time Will Tell, Faith No More's The Real Thing, and Depeche Mode's Violator, which I will go down defending. Actually, I defend to some extent all of those albums. I also owned at least one Grim Reaper CD, which I will not go down defending. I'm pretty sure I always knew they sucked, but one of my hacker friends told me I should check them out, which I did. I suppose I should have known that nobody good called themselves, unironically, Grim Reaper. And the little background joke to that is like when I was a hacker, and I have like a long hacker kind of history, which I talked about both in the new book and in an essay in Neck Deep. My handle, everyone goes by a handle, right? In the hacker community, my handle was the Grim Reaper. I was extremely serious about myself at that time. And in fact, like there's a bit in like the earlier essay where I got my dad to get me a Land's End like tote bag that was monogrammed TGR for the Grim Reaper. He didn't know what the hell this was for. So I had this like Land's End bag that I tried to impress kids at my private school with. And, as you might guess, they were not that impressed. So where does taste come from anyway? And what does it do for us or for others? And where does it go? I mean, I had so many opinions that in recalling them, I am once again filled with the feeling each one gave me, how it felt in the mind and the mouth, saying it, how good it felt to deride an early work or a later era sellout, and to proclaim an allegiance to one band or another, and to feel better than and one with others who felt the same. And in doing so, I am alive and 15 once again. But I also didn't get the memo that there was nothing inherently better about my preferences than anyone else's. And by the time college rolled around, I should have been smarter about it. The college I went to was a function of circumstance, not intention. I had been kicked out of the fancy boarding school I was attending just 3 months before graduation. And though I had received full scholarships to 2 good colleges, capital G, capital C, I would have loved to attend. Both revoked their offers of financial aid on being informed by fancy boarding school that I had in fact not graduated. And instead, I ended up having to go to the college where my dad taught. It's a fine school, and for some, it's actually a destination. But for me, it felt like failure. It felt a little like Dawkin. Like Duncan, it was less than a half an hour from my house. In retrospect, being from Houghton and having largely through my own stupidity to go to school in Houghton drove me to attempt unsuccessfully to prove something to myself and anyone else I encountered. After all, I was the smart kid, if a little wayward on occasion, and I did like to set fires, as Kathleen noted. And at the school where my dad taught, a good engineering school, women were vastly outnumbered by men, which did not improve my prospects of affection. So by the time I found myself into my introduction to creative writing class, I was prepared to have to do some work to let everyone know I didn't really belong there. I wasn't going to end up here like them, I didn't say. I didn't like the chumps that people from here liked, or defaced road signs to represent their lame love for. So when my instructor asked everyone to introduce themselves by telling us their favorite band, having probably given up on asking new students to name their favorite writers or their favorite short story, when that one kid said his favorite band was Dawkin, I couldn't let it go. Dawkin? Dawkin? You know Dawkin sucks, right? I went on like this for a long time, and I made myself a spectacle. In college, I had assumed I wouldn't have to deal with Dawkin or with Duncan or with people from or liking either. But all I remember from it now is that feeling of satisfaction of having at last exhausted my opinions about the suckage of Dawkin, and only then noticing that my classmate was crying. So the that essay came out in a way, I should put this as like, here we go, let's put this as my background. Props to Local H, a Chicago band, as you may know. This came out of one of the projects that my wife and I run, which is called March Xmas. This year it's March Pladness, which is like an NCAA style single elimination tournament of essays about songs that we actually like play every year. So we get 64 people to write essays about songs. This was the grunge era year. And we did one about hair metal. And I didn't get, and I, so everyone like writes an essay and then people vote and we play the tournament out game by game over the course of the month. And as we were doing that during the hair metal year, the song that I couldn't get out of my head was the fucking Dawkins song. Like there was something about it that I was sort of drawn to, that sense of desire to like write something about it. Like I didn't know what it meant, like that I cared enough to write about it. And so that essay kind of comes out of that. And like part of the project of the book is trying to process grief through as a result of tragedy through thinking about stuff that doesn't seem like it has much of a point, like cultural phenomena like Dawkins, for instance, or the Renaissance Fair and things like that. And one of the things I really like about doing these kind of like big projects, like the Midwest thing we're doing at Essay Daily, or the March Pladness bracket, is this idea of being able to get people together in mass to sort of kind of gamify like the essay in a certain way. And sometimes it really leads to work that I myself sort of generate, and sometimes it doesn't. But if you really missed, I don't know, I feel like if you've never checked it out, you just missed the tournament this year. You should go to marchxness.com and check it out. But Local H, who almost no one in our tournament had ever heard of, won the tournament this year, much to the consternation of some of our fans who believe that, you know, they have a lot of feels about like grunge music. And whatever you want to say about Local H is like they were kind of on the exterior of that. Okay, so I'm going to read, but this is, in a way, this is also, it's not just a ramble. It's a good segue to the last thing I'm going to read, which is an excerpt from this new book that is coming out from Grey Wolf in like a year and a half. And it's called Predator, a memoir. And it's also a book that's trying to kind of process gun violence and mass shootings but it's trying to do that by watching the 1987 action movie Predator. You know, the Schwarzenegger one with like the alien. And it kind of takes this like idea of trying to like, you know, write about Dawkins to understand something cultural and emotional to its maximal, at least as far as I can figure out. It takes it to the max, like writing a whole book about like a fairly crappy to most people's minds, but in fact, brilliant, awesome action movie from 1987. And I can talk about this forever, so I'm not going to limit myself to doing that. I'm just going to read a little section from it where it's also kind of working through some of the ways in which Predator as a movie parented me. Because I was parented by this movie. I probably spent more time with Predator and with other action movies like this, of which I watched every single one, than I did like with my dad, which is pretty depressing. And also like has to have had some effect, right? Like, I mean, not that I think, you know, watching an action movie makes you want to go shoot something or blow up a building or something like that, but like it doesn't have no effect either, especially when you watch all of them. So this is a section where I'm thinking about one of the central kind of most exciting effects in the movie, which is the infrared effect that the Predator has. And it's just a section called On Infrared. And it has a misheard Richard Hugo epigraph, which is, "You found the thermal imaging camera, now you must start the Predator book." Obviously, Richard Hugo didn't talk about, you know, it's "you found the town, now you must start the poem." But I mishear a number of poems or sort of like poetic ethoses like in here. So this is On Infrared. "The most lasting and recognizable of Predator's many great effects is this one. The thermal imaging we see ourselves through. And this is the first point of the movie's transformation into something else." The shot behind me isn't actually a shot from the movie for the most part. I'll get to that in a minute. "The camera tracks us, our protagonists, into the trees, and we switch into an infrared shot where we track two of our team and then the whole group as they move through the jungle. These shots are beautiful and surprising, and we see our bodies in the way we previously hadn't imagined. I don't remember if I'd ever seen humans as seen through infrared before, though I probably had, since I understood immediately that it was our heat that I was seeing. But so many of my favorite shots from this film are the infrared ones. They nearly all take work. I'm not used to seeing palms and brush outlined in washes of winter blue and the flatness of our bodies, rainbow bright in stripes and patches of pink and red and orange. Without being able to read scenes in their usual color, how we make a sense of things, it's really disorienting. And each shot has to tell us how to read it, has to teach us how to read it, and has to give us time to resolve what we're seeing. So seeing and recognizing becomes what we do in most of these shots, especially the early ones where we're still learning and we don't know yet whose eyes we're seeing through. In this way, the movie asks us to do more work than we're used to, especially in an action movie. This is probably the time to mention that the more I watched Predator and the more I thought about it seriously over the past decade, the more reasonable it began to seem to me to buy an infrared camera myself so I could replicate the movie's landmark visual spectacle. So I did, and the results are what you can see behind me. The sliver of radiation that humans' eyes can parse is small, which Predator illustrates with its great cam effect. Through it, we see the way the thing sees that we cannot, and that we get the creature's POV is rare in action films, or any films, in fact. Through it, we see ourselves, our analogs, anyhow. How often do we get to really see how the other sees, how we look to someone else, to it? It's a gift, I'm telling you. And when we see ourselves through it, that's where we begin to sympathize with the thing that stalks us, be in another's POV, and it changes you a little. Science has proved what readers know, that when we read, we experience, gain a couple points of empathy. We live as a little bit as another thing in another time. So when we see as it, we become it, if in some small part. It's no little magic to see this way. And it's maybe the movie's best invention and the reason that Predator stays with us these decades later. I mean, we need the tools to see ourselves from outside ourselves now, more than we ever have before, because we are so bad at it. We're increasingly bad at it. And if the tool's an action film, I'll take the action film and direct it at my head. Really, it's remarkable we can see it all, since animals of every other sort are far more sensitive to the wavelengths of the world than we are. Even my daughter knows how little we can see. She tells me cats can see some ultraviolet that we can't, and don't even get her started on birds. We're so central to our stories, though, that our paucity remains difficult to believe. We only figured out a decade ago, for instance, that elephants communicate using super low frequencies, way below what we can hear. With their ears, for thousands of years, they have been sending messages from miles and miles away. Until then, we figured that they didn't have so much to say. They just didn't speak to us. These limited spectra of Roy G. Biv, poor and remote as they are ours. Our climbs, our hills, our stamp sand and our sunken dredge, our abandoned mines and the towns around them, our shot down congresswomen, our broken potholed roads on which we drive in our crappy 1987 Aerostars, until, rusted through, they drive no more, and lo, we mourn their passing. But at least on the roads we know, we presume we hold home field advantage. Nope. Enter the creature with thermal vision and camouflage. Advantage Predator until it dawns on Dutch, that's the Schwarzenegger character, accidentally covered in cooling mud and so invisible to it, never mind that trick would work only for like a minute, that the creature sees his body heat, not him. Is this an analog for an actor's life? Is that an analog for mine? The alien, as in most films, gets used to its advantage and underestimates its foe, our hero, and will eventually be killed for our delight. Some humans are exceptional, we understand. We aren't all bags of chaff, lay down and die, cheese-covered fried, sprawled like bodies across a plate you ate last week, and Instagrammed and still regret. You should. It was a lot. And like your photo stream, you're still filled with its culinary glory. But since then, what I've wanted most to know is this. What would it be like to see an infrared that way? Well, reader, I bought the camera. It cost $270. It arrives tomorrow. This is actually the camera, like right here, this little thing in its case. I anticipate my new eyes and my transformation. And in the interim, on the disc golf course with my daughter in a running stroller, a dude walks up to me. At first, I read the man approaching as a threat, as you should read any man approaching. And I go into defensive mode. I'm disc golfing. I have no time to bleed. But it's then revealed he's up to something else. Unsolicited, he hands me a $100 bill. Says, sometimes you just need a little help, which is true. I look around for the candid camera crew, but I don't see one. So I say thanks and take it as an endorsement of my project and my poetics. So $270 is how much this cost to make before you figure taxes and philanthropy. I mean to say it wasn't cheap. I mean to say I am not cheap. You don't want to think about the money. You want your art completely free. That's cool. Me too. I downloaded this. I want my honey beelessly, my stunts performed seamlessly, first take, without evidence of pain. My gain is another's loss. But it costs to see this way, to be this way, to occupy the world this way, to read the scaffolding under everything. I gave up sex or sleep or peace for this line, and now I find it's all just economics? Missing my nephew's baptism becomes material. See it shining in this sentence. I laid in bed for this, got laid for this, wore plaid for this. I shaved my legs for this? I don't mean to glorify the work. I could be fracking, for instance, or fixing teeth, unloading trucks for Frito-Lay so you could get your snacks on, with which you accompany the essay. You could do worse than wild cheddar extreme to pair with the fine first world wine I offer here. Someone call the predator to clarify our problems. Being hunted in the jungle by an invisible extraterrestrial tends to put things in perspective. It's harder to care about institutionalized racism or cultural imperialism when your team is being eviscerated in front of you by some crazy intergalactic predator. That's how you get the fiction of no friction in this diverse class in 1987. That's how you see yourself in it, the best part of yourself. So even after it will become clear that seeming good guy, Dylan, has betrayed our team, when the alien comes for them, Dylan will be back to being one of us, a protagonist. We say, at least he's human. He's not an alien. When he dies, he is redeemed at least a little. So I have maybe an hour while the kiddo sleeps to find a line that sounds this way, that works this way, that like Run DMC and Aerosmith collaborates and walks this way. A little post-colonially, it's easy to see, thus say, 30 years on. It's a little whack when put that way, when the DIY kids ask facetiously online, what to do with all that whey? Well, make some cheese, like $270 worth. It'll be a mean poutine. Eat it all. Be full. Become who you couldn't be before. I don't know about you, but with my thermal camera, my eyes have changed, and so my eye has changed. I'm sure of it. I see new. I'm seen. I'm something new. I'm trying anyway. By now, I've convinced myself you've never seen anything like me before. You haven't, have you? Lie to me if necessary. And I think I'll stop with it there. I could go on about Predator for a long time, but we can talk more about that if Kathleen has feelings about Predator or if you do. So thanks so much for having me come and join you and read here.